Yes, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present our paper here in Moscow. And I just want to give you a brief overview of what we're going to present. First of all, I would like to present to you the research project from which our paper comes, which is a little bit different and not dealing with national identity. Then give you a brief overview of our research design. Afterwards, posing the question whether there's a post-national national identity developing, as we found incidents of identity or national identity formation, which does not fit to traditional concepts of national identity. Then Richard will present the new diaspora community, the creation of new civil society actors, which we were able to observe. Then we will have a look into Russia at the other as a part of the national identity formation. And finally, we will look at Maidan values as European values before coming to the conclusions. But just to start with our research project, the paper we are going to present here is a side result of a larger research project which the Institut für europäische Politik in Berlin and the Institute for Public Affairs conducted in 2015 and 2016. And the research question of that project was whether the Ukrainian diasporic community in Germany and the Ukrainian diasporic community in Poland contribute to the democratization of Ukraine. We had a very much policy-oriented research project with 3 project goals. The first project goal was a mapping of the civic engagement of Ukrainians in both countries, so getting an overview what types of engagement we are able to observe. Secondly, we wanted to research whether the events since November 2013 in Ukraine influence the civic engagement of both diasporas or diasporic groups. And finally, the final task of our research project was to give policy recommendations to the German government, to the Polish government, and also to the EU institutions, how these institutions could facilitate the civic engagement of the Ukrainian diaspora to contribute to democratization. The idea was that the governments do not implement own projects but support the civic or civil society actors and in turn contribute to democratization of Ukraine. Just to give you a little background, our research institute as a think tank is not doing just research but also capacity development. So we have a branch working on capacity building in the European neighborhood, and there the colleagues do such projects as enabling the civil society in Ukraine itself and also enabling the Ukraine Parliament and the Ukraine government to participate in EU policy. And from that background, which is very much policy oriented, the project comes from. How did we conduct the project? We had 80 guided interviews, more than 40 in Germany and more than 40 guided interviews in Poland, with, on the one hand, actively engaged people, so people from civil society who conduct projects with regard to Ukraine and which are active in both countries, and also experts which have a larger overview of the scene of Ukrainians in both countries. These qualitative interviews we transcribed, and following the qualitative content analysis according to Myring, we coded the interviews in a deductive and inductive way. So with our initial hypothesis, we started coding the interviews to get an answer to whether the civil society actors contribute to democratization of Ukraine, or whether we can find examples there. But we also inductively coded the interviews to find when we came across new interesting elements, and the paper we're going to present here is one of these elements that we came across, an emerging kind of national Ukrainian identity, or how we call that, Ukrainianness among the civil society actors in Germany of the Ukrainian diaspora. And after this more brief theoretical part, Richard will go into that in more detail. So what we then or one of the points we are focusing on is that we find something like an emerging Ukrainian national identity abroad, which obviously does not fit anymore to the traditional concepts of nation. If you follow on the one hand the concept of Friedrich Meinecke of Kulturnation, culture, nation of culture, which has a common culture, a common language, and a common religion, which is kind of really exclusive community where people are part of the nation given by birth. Obviously, such a concept does not fit anymore to the if you're looking for a group which defines itself with regard to a certain country which is living abroad. So there is a cross-border dimension. And also, if we have a look at the concept of Staatsnation, nation of state, with a unified nation, state, and people, which is much more inclusive, as not everyone, as not just people who are born into that community are part of the nation, but everyone who wants to be part and confesses to the constitution and to the rules is part of that, but also that concept does not fit to a diaspora which is part of a nation. First of all, we have a decreasing cost of transportation and decreasing cost of communication as a global development, and here due to these two developments, the diaspora more frequently interacts with the home country than before. So in the past you had a clear separation between the diaspora and the home country, but nowadays due to these developments and especially due to social media, the interaction comes more there's more interaction between the diaspora and the home country, and social media, that is something what our interview partners reported is very important for them. On the one hand, getting the information from Ukraine, not just reading in the morning a Ukrainian newspaper, watching Ukrainian TV and listening to Ukrainian radio, but also using Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms to lively interact with the events in Ukraine. So many of our interview partners reported that they were discussing with their friends and with their relatives on the Maidan, and this way they became part of the public debate in Ukraine while living in Germany. And this way you have a political participation which suddenly starts to crossing borders. So part of the Ukrainian political debate are people grown up in Germany, living in Germany, having a German cultural background, and that way also the cultural exchange increases. And that obviously conflicts with the previous given definition of nation, as suddenly a new other culture is brought into that concept of a newly developing nation. And also this concept that the state and the nation are inseparable is in conflict with such developments, as suddenly people living abroad in another country, being citizens of that country, start participating in the political debates of another nation. And these are the research questions we want to go a little bit more into detail, but still to say, as these are just side effects of our research project, which had other purpose, that's a very preliminary thoughts we want to develop further, and Richard is going into the more deep detail in the developing of a diaspora community.
Yeah, as Julian just mentioned, I will now elaborate a little bit further on the different groups of Ukrainians living in Germany we could see in Germany through our or in our project and through our interviews. We could observe two different groups of Ukrainians living in Germany. The first of which is quite a closed, established group, which we called the oldest diaspora. And the second group we observed was a much looser group of Ukrainians who came to Germany over the last decades, which we called the diasporic community. So, in the sense of William Safran and Robin Cohen, the old diaspora can pretty much be seen as a classical diaspora. And in the context of our research project, we defined this group as a rather homogeneous group of Ukrainians, or the descendants of Ukrainians, who were driven to Germany either voluntarily or by force during the 1940s and the 1950s. So in this time, especially in the 1950s, Germany became one of the cultural centers of the Ukrainian diaspora in Europe. But since that time, the influence or the importance of this group has pretty much lost in importance and influence, because many of the Ukrainians who came to Germany in that time moved back to Ukraine or moved on to other Western European countries or to Canada and the US. Today, this group, this former pretty influential group, is very small, with a rising average age, since especially the descendants of those Ukrainians are not, they don't see themselves anymore as part of this diaspora. Instead, they are very, very well integrated into the German society. Besides this group, there's a second group which we observed in our project, which we call the Ukrainian diasporic community. This group mainly consists of Ukrainians who have come to Germany over the last couple of decades, especially students, labor migrants, and or the spouses of Germans or Ukrainians living already in Germany. Many of those members or our interviewees do not consider themselves as part of a Ukrainian diaspora, or even deliberately reject the term as such and say we are not part of a Ukrainian diaspora, we are just Ukrainians living abroad, living in Germany for a definite or an indefinite amount of time. This group, before Euromaidan, this group was mainly characterized by a very low level of networking and really a lack of a sense of community or lack of belonging, like I said before. But, and that was like one of the most interesting part of our research, we could observe, or with the starting of the Euromaidan in November 2013, we could observe a new kind of a national identity building within this group. So that the Euromaidan has functioned as a trigger for the civil engagement and the networking of members of this group, and kind of a trigger for a new community building within this group. So we could see a mobilization and politicization of Ukrainians in Germany, a diasporic community, triggered by the Euromaidan and further enhanced by the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the war in the eastern parts of Ukraine, which led to the establishment of quite a lot of new diasporic community organizations, initiatives, so the emergence of new civil society actors who are not part of the old diaspora. Until today, those groups, those initiatives are still undergoing a process of institutionalization and professionalization. Mainly in the beginning, in 2013, they were focusing on political protests like the Euromaidan Wache, the Euromaidan Watch, trying to do political activities. With the first violent outbursts in 2013, they turned more and more to humanitarian and military support, but at the same time tried to establish information activities aimed at the German public to make sure that the German perception of the conflict in Ukraine is right. So our hypothesis is that the mobilization and politicization of Ukrainians since late 2013 has resulted in a new diasporic community in Germany, which is not part of the classic diaspora. Like I said, this group mainly consists of migrant laborers, of students, and is characterized by a high level of national and transnational networking, mainly through social media, like Julian said before. And to a certain degree, one could even talk about the building of a new transnational public sphere, a digital diaspora, in which members of the diaspora community in Germany can participate in debates not only in Germany, but also in Ukraine and in other countries all over the world. So our definition of the diaspora community follows pretty much the theoretical thoughts of Roger Brubaker, who said that imagined community can be seen as, or can be built through a joint activities and through the adoption of joint stances. So this was the first very interesting result we could see in our research. Joint activities as an initial trigger for a community building. But then in a second step we could also identify two other elements of the building of a common identity. The first, a clear adoption of a European stance, the clear adoption of European values, on which Julian will elaborate a little further, as being shared values and a shared base for their activity. And third, a clear demarcation of Russia, in which Russia is perceived as the other with regards to what we call Ukrainianness. So Russianness in this context is pretty much perceived as the antipode to a Ukrainian national identity. So on the one hand we have the vilification of Russia, and on the other hand a pro-European drive within this community. Whereas many scholars point out that the function as Russia as the other is of great historical importance in the Ukrainian national identity building throughout history. This was further enhanced through Euromaidan and the war in the eastern parts of Ukraine. Nevertheless, the question of national identity was pretty much wasn't very much discussed in the debates over the last couple of years. Like Taras Kusio put it in 2016, Ukraine 2004 cannot be understood without including national identity within our scholarly analysis. Opposition politicians seeking the path of returning to Europe for their countries did so on the basis of national identity that sought to leave Russia behind and revive a national identity within Europe. So throughout our interviews, we could see a clear process of othering of Russia, a demarcation of Ukraine from Russia, or as one interviewee put it, this is what we ask of Europe and the whole world, to accept us not being Russian, but as Ukrainians with an own culture, language, and values. So, in the same way as the Euromaidan has functioned as a catalyst, as a trigger for joint civil engagement, it has also functioned or has imposed the question upon many members of the community what it means to be Ukraine, what Ukrainianness means. Like one interviewee said, the question of identity wasn't raised before. They, the Ukrainians, were there, talking to slaves such as Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians, and so on. There was no "I am Ukrainian," and now suddenly, indeed, I am Ukrainian. So this identity building process was pretty much orientated itself pretty much on this dichotomy between the EU and Russia, where the European Union was equalized with European values, and Russia often described as an aggressor being driven by nationalism and chauvinism. This vilification of Russia became further apparent in the use of language, or the use of language like the interviewees described it. As one interviewee said, Russian speaking. Well, I say, since the annexation of Crimea, I cannot hear Russian anymore. It is an inner conflict. Unbelievably, you cannot stand to listen to your mother tongue, which you love. It gives me goosebumps. For me, Russian is connected to lies and aggression. And for me, speaking Ukrainian is a political statement. So we can see that there's the emergence of a new civil actor, a new, one could even say, imagined community through common civic engagement and through other processes like the vilification, the othering of Russia, and the adoption of European values, on which Julian will now elaborate a little further.
Yeah. Okay, I try to be very brief. As Richard quoted, the Ukrainians in the diaspora community or in the diaspora said that they have their own values, and so in the interviews we ask for those values, and one of the astonishing results was that they don't talk about Ukrainian values but refer to European values. We did not ask them whether about European values. Framing these values they all share among each other on the Maidan and also in the diaspora. They framed them on their own as European but not as universal, as some examples like human rights, like democracy and freedom of speech, transparency, that could also, these values could also be framed as being universal, but they closely focused on saying that these are European values and they consider Europe as a community of values. These headline of the, for example, just to give you an example, the headline of that slide, Maidan, values are European values, is also a quote from one of the interviews which bluntly put it like that. And what's also interesting, that the interview partners were very much focused on Europeanizing Ukraine. They said the aim of their activities is to make Ukraine a European country, which, with regard to these values, democracy, transparency, anti-corruption, freedom of speech, which is in that respect a European country, and membership of the European Union was not such important. And one of our hypotheses was that that takes a diffusion place in the activities of the interviewees, that in their cooperation with partners in Ukraine, they bring these values in practical terms into Ukraine. With regard to the time limit, I won't go into much into detail. That we can leave up for the discussion. But they actively participated in Europeanizing Ukraine. And here, from the perspective of a developing national identity or Ukrainianness, it's quite interesting that you have such a clear post-national dimension, that they consider the values of their identity as being that of a post-national, national or supranational project, which does not fit in the understanding of traditional national identity, as it has no clear separation from the other nations in Europe, but sees them as Ukrainians see themselves as being part of this larger community of Europeans. So just to sum up what we have presented, first of all, one finding is that we have an increasing civic engagement among the Ukrainians in Germany and also in Poland. There we had the emerging new diasporic community, where it's still open how that will develop in the future. So far we have a community which is defined mostly by participation, but whether it will develop into maybe an imagined community following Ben Anderson, that will up to future research in the future, as the processes are still going on. But in that direction we had some elements as in the traditional way, defining Russia as the other, which is very much in line with traditional forms of national identity formation. On the other hand, we have the social media processes, which I briefly summarized, where we have this cross-border dimension of political participation, so that the group of people participating in political debates in Ukraine are nowadays much larger than the Ukrainians living in Ukraine. Also, we have the European values as an integral part of the emerging Ukrainianness or Ukrainian identity, which also has a clear post-national dimension. And so neither the concept of Kulturnation nor the concept of Staatsnation fit to describe these empirical findings. Kulturnation is much too inclusive with regard to this focus on birth, who is part of the community, but also Staatsnation, which is more open and not such exclusive. It is more inclusive, as everyone who wants to or who accepts the values and who confesses to the common rules can be part of that. But still, here it is interesting that we have a nation or a national identity developing, which cuts across borders and is not limited to the border of the state, which is part of the definition of states nation, and these are the points we want to develop further in the research, as we find these findings from our research project quite puzzling. Thank you very much for your attention.